este seminario que corresponde al tercer ciclo de la segunda sesión 2008 del seminario Seguridad y Desarrollo en la relación México, Estados Unidos, Canadá. Este seminario ha sido posible gracias al apoyo de varias instituciones, a las que reconozco en este momento, al Consulado de Estados Unidos en Tijuana en especial por el apoyo que nos ha dado, al Consejo Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología y a los colegas del Colegio de la Frontera Norte, en particular al doctor José María Ramos, que se ha encargado de su promoción y organización. En esta ocasión el tema pues es igualmente relevante de los que ya se han trabajado en el seminario, referido a la política actual de Estados Unidos y posibilidades de cooperación bilateral. Es un tema fundamental de la relación México-Estados Unidos y en Canadá. Quiero dar especial bienvenida a Charles Seid, cónsul de Asuntos Públicos del Consulado General de Estados Unidos en Tijuana, muchas gracias. También a Lynn Roach, cónsul de Asuntos Públicos en el Consulado de Estados Unidos en Guadalajara. Mil gracias, Lynn, por el apoyo y la colaboración para la realización de este seminario. Solo quiero comentar que para el Colegio de la Frontera Norte es muy importante tener este tipo de análisis y de reflexiones que sobre todo contribuyan a construir escenarios de cooperación México-Estados Unidos y con Canadá. Las fronteras son cada vez espacios regionales más complejos, más difíciles de su gobierno y administración, y como ahora pues sujetos a presiones que en este punto las referimos al rubro de seguridad fronteriza, si bien pues las fronteras también son y han sido históricamente espacios permeables y de cooperación. Entonces nuestro espíritu es de que estos rubros de seguridad puedan ser convertidos también en rubros de cooperación y sobre todo de superación de los retos que alrededor del rubro de seguridad vive la frontera, en particular la México-Estados Unidos, si bien como tendremos oportunidad, también hay esta discusión con otros contextos y otras características en la frontera de Estados Unidos con Canadá. Le doy la bienvenida a todos los colegas que están participando en el seminario. I would like to thank you, all of you, for coming to Colegio. For us it's very important to have you here, and I think that this discussion of the seminar will contribute to solve many of the issues that are among our borders, and I think this seminar will be part of the analysis and discussion that we would like to provide to our policymakers to solve in a better way the challenges of this region between Mexico and the United States, and also the United States and Canada. We'd like to thank you, all of you, particularly to our friends of the consulate. Thank you very much for coming with us. And I would like to finish my comments right now and welcome to the Charles Seid, Consul of Asuntos Públicos. Thank you very much, and I would like to hear your comments about this seminar.
Thank you, Doctor. Well, my comments are almost exclusively words of thanks. I have come to have a great deal of respect for COLEF, not only as an academic institution, but a great deal of respect for the importance that COLEF holds in informing Mexican opinion. COLEF, I believe, is funded by the Mexican Congress, and in turn acts as an advisor to Congress and the Mexican government in general, and I believe is responsible for the formation of Mexican opinion and the official Mexican standpoint on a number of issues related to our bilateral relationship. So I certainly recognize the importance of your institution, Doctor, but I think you also deserve a great deal of credit and a nod for going to all the efforts that you do to try to understand fully U.S. opinion, which is not an easy task to do because we have such a diversity of opinion. And I have to congratulate you on on the list of speakers that you've brought today, because I think it represents very well the diversity of opinion that we have in the United States, where border security matters are very much under debate constantly. So thank you, sir, and to all our participants, a special thank you to you too. And I'm particularly happy to see that not only do we have a variety of opinion on matters relating to the Mexico-U.S. border, but also the Canadian-American border. So thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite Lynn Roach to give us a comments, please. We don't hear.
Okay, ahorita.
It's ready.
Muy buenos días y muchas gracias por la oportunidad de estar con ustedes otra vez. Ha sido para nosotros muy interesante seguir con este ciclo de conferencias, y aunque la semana pasada nos quejamos del calor, hoy se complica mucho con la lluvia aquí en Guadalajara. Entonces va llegando la audiencia, creo que vamos a recibir más gente aquí. Y vamos a estar con ustedes para esta primera parte hasta su descanso, y entonces estamos esperando pláticas de las conferencias y también participar con comentarios y preguntas. Muchísimas gracias por esta oportunidad, porque sí se siente aquí en Guadalajara también los asuntos de la frontera, aunque no estemos en la frontera, pero es que conversamos, dialogamos y nos afecta mucho también aquí en Guadalajara. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Lynn. Quiero terminar solo para dar un agradecimiento especial al doctor Manuel García y Griego, quien pues ha sido un colega que en particular ha motivado esta red de trabajo con la que ahora contamos en esta reunión. Muchas gracias, Manuel, por este acercamiento. Lo menciono porque hace casi un año intentamos un proyecto macro de análisis sobre pues los retos tan complejos de la frontera norte. El proyecto no logró financiamiento en una competencia muy severa. Estuvimos en la gran final, todos los colegas que participamos, pero no obstante su herencia continúa. Ese trabajo lo seguimos haciendo con gran entusiasmo, y quiero agradecer esa colaboración de Manuel. También pues aprovecho para mencionar muy rápido y agradecer a Gordon Dillmore su presencia, a Don Alper, a Raúl Benítez, que probablemente nos alcance, nos enlaza, al doctor César Cereceres, también extraordinario colega que hemos tenido oportunidad de dialogar con él ya tiempo atrás, a Han Lee y a todos ustedes que participan en la sesión. Muchas gracias. Y entonces pues comenzamos. I think that this presentation will be in any language. We may choose Spanish, French, German, even Chinese. No problem with that. Well, thank you very much, and welcome all of you to Clave. It's our privilege to have you here. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, ahora le daremos la palabra a Héctor Vindiola. Héctor Vindiola es actualmente coordinador de programas del Consulado General de Estados Unidos en Tijuana, quien moderará la primera sesión de esta jornada. Adelante, maestro Vindiola.
Sí, muy buenos días a todos, bienvenidos. Pues vamos a presentar a nuestro primer ponente, el doctor Manuel García y Griego, que es actualmente el director del Southwest Hispanic Research Institute en la Universidad de Nuevo México. El doctor García y Griego posee una licenciatura en Princeton en Historia, una maestría por el Colegio de México en Demografía y su doctorado en UCLA en Historia. El doctor García y Griego ha fungido como profesor maestro en el Departamento de Historia y director en la Universidad de Nuevo México, así como en el Departamento de Ciencias Políticas, en el Centro de Estudios Mexicoamericanos, en la Universidad de Texas en Arlington, y algunos otros puestos también de relevancia. Dentro de sus obras y publicaciones se encuentra el volumen de la migración de mexicanos no documentados a los Estados Unidos, los trabajadores mexicanos en los Estados Unidos, resultados de encuestas y la relación México-Estados Unidos, conflictos y convergencia. Pues vemos que es un gran experto en la cuestión de migratoria y su incidencia en la política nacional de los Estados Unidos. Entonces pues le damos la bienvenida con el tema de hoy, que será el interés nacional y la cooperación bilateral, el diálogo inevitable de tres vecinos. Bienvenido, doctor.
Muchas gracias. As a representative of one of three universities organizing this event, I want to welcome everyone present, and I appreciate the participation from other locations. I want to thank also el Colegio La Frontera Norte for hosting this very important and needed workshop at this time. I'll be doing my presentation in Spanish, but I thought at least I would make sure that people knew that I do know some English. El título de mi exposición es El interés nacional y la colaboración bilateral, el diálogo inevitable entre tres vecinos. La región de América del Norte contiene en el fondo dos relaciones bilaterales, la de Estados Unidos-Canadá y la de Estados Unidos-México. La economía, población e impacto internacional de Estados Unidos es demasiado grande para tratar la región como una trilateral. Además, la relación México-Canadá es demasiado débil, cuando menos en su momento actual, para que podamos hablar de una sola relación trilateral. Es en el fondo dos relaciones bilaterales con cierta coordinación y comunicación trilateral. El aceptar esto como hecho no significa, sin embargo, que debamos descartar totalmente la posibilidad de una coordinación trilateral. Esa coordinación es posible cuando partimos reconociendo el hecho de que descansa en dos ejes la relación bilateral Estados Unidos-Canadá. Por un lado, una relación histórica, larga, amistosa y con muchos detalles muy particulares que casi no existen entre otras relaciones bilaterales en el mundo, y la relación Estados Unidos-México igualmente complicada, igualmente profunda, con ciertas dimensiones interesantes que tampoco encontramos entre cualquier otros dos países del mundo. Estas dos relaciones bilaterales tienen sus grandes diferencias y a lo mejor van a surgir algunos comentarios al respecto, pero yo voy a querer subrayar las similitudes porque es allí donde podamos hablar de ciertas posibilidades de colaboración y de diálogo entre los tres países. Ahora, el tema de la seguridad es el tema fundamental cuando tratamos de asuntos bilaterales y de política exterior. La integridad del territorio, el control del Estado sobre sus fronteras y el control que éste tenga sobre sus intercambios con otros países, la autonomía o, como suele decirse, la soberanía, todos son elementos indispensables en la definición del interés nacional hacia el exterior. Cada país tiene su discurso particular para expresar ante su público estos temas. En Canadá, por muchos años, el reto era negociar su situación geopolítica de ser el único territorio ubicado geográficamente entre dos países, dos superpotencias en plena Guerra Fría. Imagínense ser el único país entre la Unión Soviética y Estados Unidos en época de un posible intercambio nuclear. En México, el reto era negociar la contradicción entre su relación económica estrecha con Estados Unidos y a la vez una relación histórica complicada, un distanciamiento político e histórico frente al país que le quitó la mitad de su territorio del norte. Dicho de otra forma, para Canadá era, en las palabras de Pierre Trudeau, era como estar en la misma recámara con un elefante. Y por otro lado, para los mexicanos era tratar de negociar la contradicción entre una dependencia por un lado y una relación estrecha y necesaria por el otro. En Estados Unidos, el reto en estas dos relaciones bilaterales era buscar una colaboración con sus vecinos a la misma vez que se encontrara con las obligaciones y complicaciones de una superpotencia mundial. El mundo exterior para Estados Unidos cambió radicalmente después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Sus intereses, su postura, su proyección era global, una situación totalmente distinta a la de la situación regional en la que se encontraba antes de ese momento. Ahora bien, han pasado casi 7 años desde septiembre de 2001 y está más claro ahora cuál es el perfil de opciones y políticas sobre seguridad y de posibilidades de colaboración trilateral. Solo tengo tiempo para hacer algunas observaciones puntuales. La más evidente es que Estados Unidos ha subrayado la conexión seguridad fronteriza y terrorismo al grado de que el tema de inmigración esté permeado de las preocupaciones de seguridad, cosa que no era tan evidente y tan candente en el periodo anterior de 2001. Ahora, hay cierta lógica en esto. Digo, la ilógica la sabemos muy bien, pero hay cierta lógica y cabe mencionar cuál podría ser esta. Puede parecer cínico, aunque la diferencia entre cinismo y realismo a veces es difícil trazar, pero puede parecer cínico, pero puede sorprender que el tema de terrorismo sea planteado principalmente como una cuestión de la vulnerabilidad del país a la entrada de terroristas extranjeros. Pero además hay una lógica sustantiva ineludible, una lógica que entenderíamos perfectamente bien en México. Estados Unidos no controla los flujos de entrada a su territorio, véase migración de indocumentados mexicanos. Si varias centenas de miles de mexicanos logran perforar la frontera, otros extranjeros, léase nacionales con planes de provocar actos de violencia política, también pueden hacerlo. El sentimiento de vulnerabilidad externa, tan conocida por los mexicanos, se generaliza en Estados Unidos después del 9/11 y continúa hasta nuestros días. La respuesta política estadounidense, después de invadir a Afganistán y a Irak, fue reorganizar la burocracia federal y establecer el nuevo Departamento de Homeland Security, algo sin precedente en Estados Unidos. Las respuestas de ese departamento se han centrado en el uso de tecnología, nuevas técnicas de vigilancia en la frontera y en el interior de Estados Unidos para monitorear posibles amenazas. Algunos de mis colegas posteriormente tratarán algunos de estos temas y con más detenimiento. Otras respuestas han sido buscar la colaboración, especialmente mediante el intercambio de información con los aparatos de seguridad de otros países, incluyendo a Canadá y con México. Esta respuesta también es lógica. La lucha contra una red internacional desconcentrada, sin coordinación jerárquica, necesita de mayor intercambio de información. Francamente, a mí me sorprende que el grado de colaboración bilateral entre Estados Unidos y sus vecinos hacia el norte y hacia el sur haya sido tan limitado en los últimos 7 años. El hecho de que se construya un cerco a lo largo de buena parte de la frontera entre México y Estados Unidos, por encima de las objeciones públicas e inusitadas del presidente de México, me dice que algo faltó en el diálogo bilateral con el país del sur. Es una obviedad, pero a veces nos toca a los académicos decir lo obvio. El hecho de que la frontera norte con Canadá esté desprotegida y que eso no provoque alguna acción bilateral Canadá-Estados Unidos, es una indicación de que algo también anda mal allí. La General Accountability Office del gobierno de Estados Unidos ha mostrado lo fácil que es trasladar el equivalente de material para un artefacto nuclear por la frontera Canadá-Estados Unidos. Curiosamente sería tal vez más fácil de Canadá a Estados Unidos que de México a Estados Unidos. Ahora, México, Estados Unidos y Canadá tomarán decisiones según su concepción del interés nacional. Cuando actúen bilateral o trilateralmente, será porque la acción colectiva sirva a sus independientes intereses nacionales. No puede ser de otra manera. ¿Será posible que la colaboración limitada actual obedece a la ausencia de un interés común entre esos tres países en sus relaciones bilaterales? Considero que, aun cuando sea posible, la probabilidad es baja. Existen posibilidades de promover los intereses de estos países con una mayor colaboración, pero estos han encontrado obstáculos, probablemente internos, para ello. Los tres países han encontrado más fácil ignorar el tema en el corto plazo, aun cuando los beneficios de tratarlo serían mayores en el largo plazo. Las intervenciones que siguen en diferentes formas y con distintas ópticas intentarán desarrollar hipótesis similares. Uno de los obstáculos para una mayor colaboración entre México y Estados Unidos es las diferencias en definiciones de seguridad en estos dos países. En México, la seguridad fronteriza tiende a verse como un tema mucho más amplio que en Estados Unidos. Otro obstáculo es la impaciencia estadounidense con las formas culturales y con el aprendizaje de las normas organizativas de organismos gubernamentales mexicanos. En algunas ocasiones, algunos funcionarios estadounidenses han aprendido ese lenguaje y la comunicación interburocrática ha sido posible. Pero como Gordon Dillmore nos podrá mostrar con su amplia experiencia en la frontera en Vermont y también en El Paso, esto no es tarea fácil. Como ejemplo, véase la actual controversia sobre el financiamiento de material de seguridad para México bajo el Plan Mérida. Dos de nuestros colegas tratarán ese tema candente posteriormente. Los riesgos de continuar con el statu quo son altos. Para Estados Unidos, la colaboración bilateral con sus vecinos ofrece la posibilidad de bajar costos. Dado que la defensa al terrorismo es un barril sin fondo, cualquier mecanismo que ofrezca información y opciones políticas reales a menor costo es una ventaja potencialmente importante. Para sus vecinos al norte y al sur, el statu quo ofrece otros riesgos. Tarde o temprano habrá otro ataque en Estados Unidos. No es cuestión de si lo habrá, la pregunta es cuándo y bajo qué circunstancias. Si los ataques tienen algún vínculo con la frontera con México o con Canadá, los costos para estos países son posiblemente muy altos. Esto en todos los renglones en términos de comercio, de las dificultades que actualmente ya se están viendo con el conflicto entre seguridad y el Tratado de Libre Comercio, y los costos para Canadá y para México pueden ser altísimos, no solamente en términos económicos. Además, como lo han experimentado España, Inglaterra y otros países, México y Canadá también son vulnerables. Las circunstancias de política y de seguridad actuales son muy diferentes a las de hace 7 años. Esperemos utilizar las oportunidades de colaboración bilateral existentes para mejorar las condiciones de la región de América del Norte. De ser cierto lo que acabo de afirmar, el diálogo entre los tres países, entre los tres vecinos, es un diálogo inevitable. Es un diálogo inevitable porque jamás podremos descansar en la posibilidad de que hemos agotado todas las opciones que tengamos para poder reducir los costos y maximizar los posibles beneficios entre los tres países. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, doctor García y Griego. El tema fundamental lo mencionó, que es la cooperación transfronteriza México, Canadá y Estados Unidos. Y el doctor partió en cuanto a las diferencias que implica la seguridad para cada país. Históricamente, la relación México-Canadá, la relación Estados Unidos-Canadá y la relación con México. Inició definiendo que la relación pues, México-Canadá es demasiado débil para realmente hablar de una relación histórica, y aún así no se debe descartar la cooperación trilateral en aspectos de seguridad. Partió de dos ejes principales que tienen la relación, que una fue histórica y la otra fue en cuanto a la de seguridad. Pero que también existen similitudes como puntos de referencia, que es el control del Estado en cuanto a sus fronteras y las soberanías propias, hablando de México, Canadá y Estados Unidos. Nos comentó que en Canadá su reto histórico pues estaba entre lo que fue la Unión Soviética y los Estados Unidos, y estar en el paso del riesgo de un intercambio nuclear. Y para México pues había también una dicotomía ahí en cuanto a la relación con Estados Unidos, que hablaba sobre el distanciamiento político, pero al mismo tiempo tratar de resolver esa dependencia económica con Estados Unidos y al mismo tiempo la independencia soberana. Aterrizamos hoy en día desde el 11 de septiembre y realmente los matices que tomó la relación México-Estados Unidos y Canadá pues fueron fomentados realmente por la seguridad fronteriza y el riesgo del terrorismo. E inclusive el mismo tema de la migración se puso arriba dentro de esta ecuación seguridad fronteriza y terrorismo, ¿no? Como elemento fundamental de la ecuación. Y la migración también dentro de la ecuación fue un factor en cuanto al sentimiento de vulnerabilidad que implicaba la migración hacia los Estados Unidos. Es decir, bueno, la migración hacia Estados Unidos implica mayor riesgo de terrorismo. Nos adelantó también en cuanto a la superestructura de la creación del Departamento de Homeland Security en Estados Unidos y sus implicaciones que tuvo esto para la seguridad fronteriza, y fueron dos principales, que fue realmente lo que son las nuevas tecnologías en la frontera y la colaboración en el intercambio de información con Canadá y México, que aunque también en cierta manera nos comentó que es débil dada la desconfianza. Hay mayor apertura para un mayor diálogo entre México y Canadá, pero sin embargo también nos mencionó que la frontera Canadá-Estados Unidos se mantiene muy porosa y con la misma vulnerabilidad de poder introducir material radioactivo por ella, ¿no? Así como la migración. También nos comentó sobre los obstáculos que existen para el diálogo entre México y Estados Unidos, y realmente versa sobre las diferencias en las definiciones de la seguridad nacional que implica para cada país. Esto, el concepto de seguridad nacional, para México tiende a ser muy general, la definición muy amplia, y nos indica también el doctor que pues, para Estados Unidos en cuanto a México es muy complicado en ocasiones entender el funcionamiento de las instituciones mexicanas. En cuanto a los beneficios de la cooperación, nos manifiesta el doctor que pues realmente es la reducción de costos. Hablemos de costos compartidos en la relación trilateral, en el intercambio y una apertura a un mayor diálogo entre los países. Y termina concluyendo en la cuestión de que México y pues Canadá también son vulnerables ante el nuevo escenario, y que habrá que aprovecharse de las coyunturas y fomentar el diálogo para maximizar los beneficios y minimizar los obstáculos. Gracias. Ahora seguimos con nuestro siguiente ponente, con el señor Gordon Delmore, de la Universidad de Houston. Señor Gordon Delmore es el director del centro en Southwest Public Safety Technology Center. Después de 7 años ejerciendo lo que es la Procuración de Justicia y Seguridad Pública en el National Law Enforcement and Corrections Technology Centers Program, también ha estado ha sido gerente de seguridad en FEMA, en el Departamento de Seguridad Interior de los Estados Unidos. En su experiencia ha tenido en cuanto a la operatividad de desastres de alto impacto, incluyendo Ground Zero, donde ocurrió, donde estaban las torres gemelas en el World Trade Center, ahí en el 2001, y también tiene 15 años de experiencia como consultor en lo que es seguridad pública y tecnología en seguridad nacional, para un sinnúmero de agencias federales y contratistas de defensa nacional. El señor Delmore es originalmente de Colorado y se graduó de Glen Falls. Es en Vermont, también tiene su especialidad, su grado académico en justicia criminal, y también ha tenido experiencia como pues fireman, bombero, voy a traducirlo de otra manera, como técnico de rescate, rescue technician, y como capitán de rescate. Y pues podemos continuar aquí con una serie de funciones muy interesantes del doctor Delmore. Perdón, ¿habla español? Oh, okay. Well, I just went through your bio very briefly, and I just wanted to state that's pretty impressive. So we continue with your participation. You have 20 minutes.
Okay. And I have some slides. Okay. Good morning. The topic of my presentation is the challenge of cross-border cooperation in today's world. We have the next slide, please. My name is Gordon Delmore. I'm the Center Director of the Southwest Public Safety Technology Center at the University of Houston in Houston, Texas. I won't go into too much. Oh, okay, great.
Gordon, would you speak closer to the microphone?
Okay. A little bit about my education. I started out in political science and moved to journalism and later to marine science and psychology and finally criminal justice. You'll note at the bottom, no, I really couldn't make up my mind what I wanted to do when I grew up, and actually I still haven't, so anyhow, that's the sum and substance of my education. My professional interests are in technology. I'm very interested in international conflict and terrorism, and I've studied those topics for a number of years. My professional background is in intelligence systems and command and control systems and situational awareness, and I'm very interested in threat, risk, and vulnerability. My employment background, as mentioned earlier, I started out as a fireman, went to rescue services, and was one of the earliest EMTs in the United States. The EMT program was first started. Let's see what we got. I went from there to local law enforcement as a deputy sheriff in Dade County, Florida. I was there for about 5 years and joined the U.S. Border Patrol in 1960. Actually did my training in El Paso. At that time, all the Border Patrol training was done in El Paso. Served initially in Calexico, California, not too far east of here, for 2 years, and then transitioned to the northern border, and I served the next 14 years on the northern border at various stations in Maine and Vermont. In 1986, I was detailed to the White House, sent on loan from the Immigration Service to the White House, where I initially served on the Vice President's National Security staff, working in the counter-drug programs. Was transferred to Houston as a part of that program and served there for 2 years, and then moved from there to Washington, where I worked at the White House for a year, and then ended my career with the Immigration Service, coming out to El Paso, where I served on the staff at Joint Task Force 6. After that, I went into consulting, did consulting for a number of years before I went back to the Department of Justice as a project manager for the National Institute of Justice. I've done security consulting. For the last 11 years, I've worked part-time for FEMA as in the security cadre as a security officer. I served at Ground Zero after the 9/11 incident for the first 4 weeks, where I was the liaison to the New York City Office of Emergency Management, the mayor's office. My topic is the challenge of border cooperation in today's world. How do we balance the critical need for national security with the sometimes competing interests, trade, commerce, travel, and humanity? As a disclaimer, I am not an apologist. I'm not an apologist. I'm not an advocate. I'm simply, I've gathered my impressions over the past 50 years of serving on the border, both the northern and the southern borders, and so my comments come strictly from my experiences in that respect. When we talk about national priorities, regardless of what country you're from, every country needs national priorities. We wouldn't exist otherwise. And those are comprised of national security, hopefully a stable government, economic prosperity, and humanitarian needs, the concern for the people. One could ask, why is there a need for cross-border cooperation? And I submit that it's due to common interests that we have, the basic matter of survival, culture. Our relations are not limited to living in one country. We're spread out all over the place. I have a daughter who lives currently in Canada, and I have a grandson who's currently living in Italy, so I have an interest in those countries as well as the United States. Our families and friends move around. We've become a very mobile society, and we can find family and friends in almost any country in the world. Business associations cross borders, and they require cooperation. Our economic welfare the same way. It doesn't stop at the border. We have economic interest in many other countries, and an interest in cross-border cooperation and resources. Here's 3 scenes from various places on the Rio Grande River, which is a shared asset between the United States and Mexico. There have been a lot of issues over who's going to get what share of the water in the Rio Grande River. And like many other things, those become matters that as neighbors we have to take up, and we have to resolve. It's in our best interest to do so. Every country needs to respect the valid national security interests of its neighbors if it's going to expect reciprocity. If it's going to expect the same treatment from its neighbor, it's got to treat its neighbor like it would like to be treated itself. That's something we have to keep in mind at all times. We have to respect our neighbors. We may not have the exact same cultures, we may not have the exact same needs and desires, but we have to try to understand each other and each other's concerns, and we have to try to deal with those. In the past, in the issues between the United States and Mexico, we tried to answer some of the problems we had with things like the Presidente program back in the 60s when I first went to Border Patrol, and amnesty, which we've gone through a number of iterations of in the United States. Those were the solutions that we came up with the problems that existed in the 1960s and 70s. Currently, we're dealing with the implementation of NAFTA. There was a lot of pros and cons in the United States about NAFTA, whether it was good or bad for the United States. I think it's overall it's worked out better than some people anticipated it would. It's got a ways to go, but the regulations and the things that have developed from NAFTA have been positive, and I think overall it has created a good environment for both, for all 3 countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The latest issue that we're faced with that is reality, particularly for you folks out here in California, is the fence, SBI-net. Something that our government in the United States decided was a necessary tool to promote national security, border security. A lot of discussion about it, and we're so early into that program that it's really too early to make much judgment on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Amnesty, again, is a topic of conversation, the possibility of another amnesty in the United States. And there's also discussion of another guest worker program. So those are current solutions that are either underway or being considered, and they're things that are going to affect relations between our 2 countries. The developing dynamic for those of us in the United States is the fact that historically local law enforcement in the United States has not been prone to enforcing immigration laws. And the popular thinking was that that was up to the job of the Border Patrol and the Immigration Service. In the last couple of years, because of various factors that have evolved, there is more interest on the part of the local authorities to get involved in enforcing the immigration laws. Some interesting figures that just came out yesterday, as a matter of fact, in the New York Times, are these. Actually, the article dealt with some actions on the part of a police department in South Carolina to deal with illegal immigration because of the rising crime rate and other factors that the city involved felt were detrimental to the welfare of the city. This is a fairly new tack on illegal immigration, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the future, whether this takes hold or just kind of goes away. It's too early to tell, really. We've seen these types of actions other places in the Phoenix area by the sheriff in that county, and other places in the country. But it does now seem to be becoming a trend, and something that's going to be interesting to watch as it develops. So where do border relations actually start? Do they start at the top of the mountain, at the summit, with government, or someplace in the middle, maybe business? Does business have the genesis in promoting cross-border relations, or is it at the base with the people, with the one-on-one type of relationships? In asking myself that question over the past years, because this is something I've been interested in ever since I went into the Border Patrol, and looking at the factors that the dynamics that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Natural disasters don't stop at the border. Typically every year or so we have a hurricane coming. I live in Houston, and we have a hurricane come into the Gulf of Mexico. It'll take a swipe through parts of Mexico and then come up around into Texas a number of times, and come directly across the border into the Brownsville area. And the results of those hurricanes, or whatever the disasters are, don't stop at the border. They come across. Crime doesn't stop at the border. One issue, local issue that we're dealing with in Texas currently is in the Del Rio area, where cross-border crime going in both directions reached the point where it got completely out of hand. After a period of time with law enforcement on both sides of the border frustrated over what was going on, and the fact that gangs were coming up from Mexico, breaking into homes in the Del Rio area. Criminals from Del Rio were going down into Mexico and being involved in criminal activity. It reached the point where local law enforcement in the Del Rio area got together with their counterparts in Mexico recently, put together a plan of cooperation where they notify each other when events happen in their respective jurisdictions. And that plan, the implementation of that plan, has created a situation where currently they've dropped their crime rate collectively on both sides of the border better than 50% in a period of about 6 months. So it's been a very effective venture. Terrorism doesn't stop at the border. We see terrorism that emanates in one country and moves to another country. That happens typically. Family relationships certainly don't stop at the border. Socioeconomics don't stop at the border, and business doesn't stop at the border. So those questions, if borders are not a barrier to those types of things, why do they have to be a barrier to cooperation? Disaster assistance in the question of, or the matter of disaster assistance, borders should not be boundaries. This picture was a picture that I took at the World Trade Center about the second week after the event there. The gentlemen in red are from a urban search and rescue team from Mexico City who came up to New York City after that happened. I understand they came up on their own nickel. They spent their own money to get there and volunteered to help at the scene there. I was there every day for 4 weeks, and I saw them there every day and many times at night. I've mentioned to a number of people in recounting the story that they were one of the most active search and rescue teams that we had at Ground Zero, because they would come in, they would get their task, they would go out, they would work, and they would complete that task, where other teams, even some of the bigger teams, would get tired, would come up against complications and get frustrated, and they would suspend operations. But this team from Mexico was there every day, always very cheerful. I'd go over and chat with them, and they always had a very positive attitude, and that always wasn't the case at Ground Zero. The interesting thing is that this team started as a result of an urban search and rescue team from the United States that went to Mexico City in 1985 in response to the earthquake, worked down there and helped to start this team. And so this was, I guess, in effect, payback with them coming up to New York City. But they really were, they were an outstanding team, and did a great job while they were there. I found over the years that cross-border relationships are more effective and enduring if they actually start with the people, if they're a one-on-one experience. And I think the reason for that is that personal trust seems to be more evident in one-on-one relationships. In times of disaster, we have a natural urge, most of us do, to help our fellow man. And that isn't border restricted. That's true no matter where the disaster happens. And we have an urge to help, to reach out, to help people that are in trouble. And I think that's one of the most interesting dynamics that we see in the border area. There are many stories of where cities on both sides of the border, and both borders in the United States, the Canadian border as well, where they reach out and help the people on the other side of the border. I think another reason that these relationships last is that their personal relationships are one-on-one, and they're much more difficult to break than government agreements, or to ignore in government agreements necessarily are. Business relationships tend to be more meaningful and durable than government agreements. They're easier to monitor, and ethics tend to be a paramount concern, a paramount issue in those types of arrangements. And I found that trust that starts at the bottom line in the one-to-one relationship usually will float to the top if it's left to grow. So in summary, my observation is that in terms of the balance between the need for national security and the competing interests, we're probably about as close to the center of gravity, the pivot point, as we've ever been. I think the current relations, while they could be better, are good. And I think we're about as close to the ultimate in that respect as we're going to get. It may improve, something may happen to cause us to change the relationships, but I think overall relationships are good and about as good as they're going to get. And another observation by a wise man that we should pay attention to, it's one of the most beautiful compensations in life. We can never help another without helping ourselves. And I think that's true. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Delmore. Nada más unos puntos de resumen sobre la exposición del señor Delmore. Habló realmente sobre los retos que tiene la relación transfronteriza en la cuestión de cooperación en seguridad. La pregunta es, ¿cómo se encuentra ese equilibrio, ese balance entre seguridad, establecer mayores medidas de seguridad, pero al mismo tiempo fomentar el flujo, vaya la redundancia, fluido de comercio y de seres humanos entre las fronteras? Pues nos comentó que los países, en este caso Estados Unidos y México, pues tenemos prioridades nacionales, siendo 4 de ellas la seguridad nacional, gobiernos estables, la prosperidad económica y las mismas necesidades humanitarias que las mismas poblaciones tienen. Comentó el por qué la cooperación fronteriza, básicamente porque poseemos intereses comunes que son la propia sobrevivencia, cultura, familia y amigos en los dos lados de la frontera, en este caso, las relaciones comerciales, el bienestar económico y el compartir recursos naturales, como en este caso él apuntó atinadamente con la cuestión del agua. Y pues como que apuntó también que como vecinos requerimos resolver estos temas en la relación bilateral, y también como vecinos esperamos reciprocidad mutua en el tratar con cada uno de nuestros respectivos gobiernos. Y habló sobre las soluciones que en el pasado se han dado a estos temas, soluciones que en cierto momento han sido problemas, y habló que en el pasado pues se resolvió eso, sobre todo en el aspecto migratorio, con el programa Bracero y con el programa de amnistía. En cuanto a las problemáticas actuales y las soluciones que se dieron para resolver esas problemáticas, nos habló sobre el Tratado de Libre Comercio de América del Norte, habló sobre el muro, the fence. No necesariamente nos sabría decir si es una resolución a un problema. También habló sobre la posibilidad de una segunda amnistía y también la posibilidad de un nuevo programa de trabajadores huéspedes, o guest worker program. Nos platicó que en cuanto a Estados Unidos existe una escasez de administración de justicia en cuanto a la cuestión migratoria, por lo que la tendencia ha sido que en Estados Unidos han sido los gobiernos locales, estatales y municipales los que han empujado iniciativas en las propias autoridades de sus congresos para realmente atacar el problema de la migración, dada la escasez de acción por la parte federal. Y nos comentó sobre en dónde empiezan, la pregunta, ¿dónde empieza la relación transfronteriza? Empieza desde el mismo pueblo, las relaciones interpersonales, los gobiernos o las relaciones comerciales. Nos comentó también, muy interesante, fueron que realmente existen temas que van más allá de las fronteras y que los compartimos. Y son estas situaciones que no paran en la frontera, como son los desastres naturales, el crimen, el terrorismo, las relaciones familiares, las relaciones socioeconómicas y pues las relaciones comerciales. Y también nos comentó pues que las relaciones transfronterizas realmente subsisten más por las relaciones interpersonales que podamos tener entre fronteras, más que las relaciones entre gobiernos. Y finalmente concluyó en decirnos pues que la relación México-Estados Unidos, en la relación transfronteriza, pues realmente estamos en la mejor época de esta relación transfronteriza. Yo sería un poco más optimista, yo esperaría que hubiese una mejora en esta relación, y estas fueron sus conclusiones. A continuación tenemos al señor Don Alper. El señor Don Alper es el director del Centro de Estudios Canadienses Estadounidenses y del Instituto de Investigación de Política Fronteriza del Western Washington University. Cabe comentar también que el señor Don Alper, fue premiado con un certificado de mérito por el Consejo Internacional de Estudios Canadienses. Este premio fue establecido en 1988 y reconoce a las contribuciones excepcionales que individuos particulares han hecho en desarrollar estudios canadienses. Entonces, señor Alper, bienvenido. Welcome. Bienvenue.
Gracias. Thank you very much. And first, let me apologize for not being able to do this presentation in Spanish. I feel bad about that because I am in Mexico, but just the way it is. Let me also thank the President and the Director General, and particularly my good friend Manuel Garcia Grego for inviting me to this very distinguished conference. My presentation is titled Canada-U.S. Border Security Cooperation, Implications for the U.S.-Mexican Border. The way I'll approach this is just to give a little background as to what has happened in terms of the kind of, thank you. A little bit of background as to what has happened in terms of the increased profile of border security on the northern border, and then talk a bit more about the components of border security cooperation between the United States and Canada, and then some of the implications that I think are important for the U.S.-Mexican border. This first slide is kind of quaint in that it highlights, I think, something that Americans and Canadians have been very proud of for at least, well, as far back as the Canada-U.S. relationship really goes. Canadians and Americans talk about the longest undefended border in the world. It's something in the neighborhood of 6,000-mile boundary. In many places along the border, there are no check posts at all. In fact, there are huge stretches in which you can't even tell there's a border. This slide is perhaps a bit of a strong contrast to the previous one, maybe stronger than it should be. I titled it The Former Longest Undefended Border, and I did that because there is a very strong view on both the Canadian and the U.S. side that something drastically has changed since 9/11. And as the quote in the slide says, 9/11 has changed U.S. views of the border from a minor point of pride to a major focus of anxiety. And although the slide would indicate that the border now is composed of a militarized fence, fortunately that is not the case. But the fence is a very important metaphor that is being used by many people to describe what has changed on the Canada-U.S. border. And the term militarization is also an important new reality in terms of the way in which the ports of entry are very heavily fortified, which is a very different situation than we had in the past. Just a quick overview of border security before 9/11. Generally speaking, border security was always a low profile. This, of course, is very different from Mexico. The most important concern seemed to be to manage criminal threats and drug threats without disrupting trade. And I emphasize without disrupting trade, because the Canada-U.S. trading relationship is so enormous. It's by far the largest bilateral trading relationship in the world. About 86% of Canadian exports go to the United States, which is unprecedented in any other bilateral relationship in the world. In those pre-9/11 days, the policing focus, and there's always been a policing focus, was primarily oriented to drug trade and other criminal activity, and also firearms. It's an interesting issue on the Canada-U.S. border because Canada has very stringent regulations and gun control laws, which are very different from the United States. And it's always been the case that when you cross the Canada-U.S. border, the inevitable question you got running from south to north is, are you carrying any firearms? Now, the emerging concern, even before 9/11, was, to some extent, the potential of terrorism insofar as Canada has always been a very multicultural society, a very diverse society. And there had been incidents, including the Air India bombing back in 1985, which involved a radical Sikh group that bombed a Pan Am airline flight over the Atlantic, killing more than 300 people. A clear act of terrorism that started to get some people's attention. And then in 1997, there was a subway plot foiled in New York that was run by a guy named Amr Mazur, who, as it turned out, was originally an illegal immigrant into Canada, had come into Canada under false pretenses. So there was some concern about security prior to, some concern about terrorism prior to 9/11. The big turning point occurred in 2000 when the so-called Millennium Bomber was caught entering the United States in Port Angeles, Washington, which is very close to where I live. He had gotten on a ferry in Victoria, British Columbia, had cleared immigration. When he left the ferry on the U.S. side in Port Angeles, a fairly, what would we say, a person who seemed to be particularly sensitive to anything that looked a little bit out of the ordinary, a customs official, a young woman who had only been doing the job for about 2 years, thought something was funny with the way he was acting. And it turned out that they searched his trunk and found a pile of explosives. He was heading for Los Angeles and was going to bomb LAX. So this really, in a sense, upticked the concern about terrorism coming from Canada in the United States. And then the next year, the Rassam case was in 2000. Of course, the year later, in 2001, we have 9/11, and we get this incredibly quick change, or the border shift, from what was up to that time considered a benign border to what then became a dangerous border. Canada was portrayed in the media, among politicians, as a potential staging area for terrorist activity. And thus suddenly Canada became a point of vulnerability in U.S. national security. This was very new, the idea that somehow Canada would be seen as a national security threat to the United States. This concern was fueled by a number of people in the United States, including some very prominent politicians, and I have some quotes up there. The first one says, "We got to remember that the people who first hit us in 9/11 entered this country from Canada." That was a Montana senator. The second quote comes from a Texas representative, also indicating that the 9/11 terrorists came from Canada. And of course, none of the terrorists came from Canada. So there was this myth being propagated in the United States that Canada had become this at least potential staging ground for terrorist attacks that could be launched on the United States. And so what you get after 9/11 is a very severe ramping up of border security, and as the two pictures show you, the checks that are going on now at the actual ports of entry are quite military oriented, very similar to what you people have experienced on the Mexican-U.S. border for many, many years. But we also have some new things happening, such as the militarization of the Great Lakes, which is the picture at the bottom. So the big question then became, after 9/11, what do you do? What's the solution to this problem? If there is this terrorist threat, if border security has suddenly become a major issue on the Canada-U.S. border, what can be done? Well, clearly the strongest imperative coming from everywhere was the border must be kept as open as possible. And this was for economic reasons. Remember what I said about 86% of Canada-U.S. trade coming across that border. And Canada is the largest U.S. export market, so it's a two-way proposition. So the basic imperative, the basic principle is that the border must be kept open as much as possible, while at the same time advancing bilateral cooperative solutions. Now, I think this is an enormous contrast to the U.S.-Mexican border, because it seems to me that the issue down here was close the border, or at least partially close the border, and then talk about solutions. I think I'll say a little more about this at the end of my talk, but I think this is a very, very important difference. Smart borders, of course, were in some ways the techno solution to the problem of essentially filtering, which both borders are attempting to do. Filtering, of course, means trying to filter out the bad guys and the bad goods and let in the good guys and the good goods, and I think we're all familiar with how smart borders operate. The Smart Border Accord between Canada and the United States was reached in late 2001, just a couple of months after 9/11, and then a similar but not identical agreement was reached with Mexico, U.S.-Mexico Smart Border Agreement in early 2002. A second element of trying to figure out what to do about all of this, of course, was the principle of risk management. And I'll have a little more to say about that in a few minutes. And then the third element, which relates to both of these, is the more recent Security and Prosperity Partnership, which seems to be moving at snail's pace. Some people really don't think it has much viability in terms of dealing with some of these critical border security issues. So what I'd like to do now is just talk about some of the key elements of border security cooperation between Canada and the United States post 9/11. And I'll try to go through these fairly quickly. The first one is what I would call convergence, which is to say that Canada's institutionally overhauled its border security structure to better align with the United States. This was not without controversy, but I think Canada felt they had no choice. They had to make it appear, at least, that they were doing everything possible to support the United States' new concern about terrorism and the northern border. This involved things like bringing in a new anti-terrorism law, which is very similar to the U.S. Patriot Act, and some would even say it goes further. And it also included an enormous investment of dollars to better align Canadian programs and border security in general with the United States. The second element was the institution of trusted traveler and carrier shipper programs at the major crossings. And these are the Nexus program, which is the fast lane for pre-approved frequent travelers. Your version of that down this border is the Sentry program. The FAST program, which was for shippers and truckers. Again, if you are properly checked out and your company is checked out, then you have a special lane you can travel in, and you're supposed to get fast-track treatment at the border. And then the CPAT, which is the Canadian version of FAST. A third element which is quite interesting. We talked a little bit about this at dinner last night, and I won't have time to get into it now, but we can talk about it during the question period if you'd like, is an attempt to bring in joint pre-clearance programs. And in particular what that means is Americans doing the clearance in Canada. And this is actually happening at eight Canadian airports. It's happening at some of the major rail points. It's happening at the major container terminals at the largest Canadian ports. And also, and I think this is a very positive move, is the creation of 7 joint border facilities. That is to say, border facilities which are manned and operated by Canadians and Americans in an equal fashion. I think it's a very, very good omen. The Safe Third Country Agreement, I think I'll skip that. The Enhanced Driver's License, or the EDL, which began in Washington State and British Columbia to meet the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative document requirements, which will go into effect in June 2009 on both borders. WITI document requirements essentially means that you will have to have a passport or some other approved DHS form of document in order to be allowed back into the United States. The Enhanced Driver's License, which is now in operation in Washington State, counts as a WITI approved document. And then finally, a number of joint law enforcement initiatives, IBETS, which is Integrated Border Enforcement Teams, which is essentially the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Coast Guard and the Canadian border, the American border people all working in common across the border, the cross-border crime forum, and finally the Shipwriter Project, which is quite interesting because it involves cross-designation of officers on patrol boats in the Great Lakes and along the Pacific Northwest marine coast, who can go back and forth in Canadian and American waters without special permission in dealing with criminal kinds of activities. A very interesting program, which has been a pilot program, but now it is going to be instituted into law. Now, there's a number of factors in the success of some of these programs. They're not all a huge success, and some of them are very controversial. But let me quickly run through them. For the most part, all of these agreements have been built on previous agreements, previous protocols. In other words, there's been a sound foundation, a solid foundation before 9/11 for a number of these agreements, such as the Integrated Border Enforcement Teams is a good example. The second factor in success is that there has always been a very strong relationship, a set of relationships at the working level, both at the regional, state, and provincial level, but also at the national level. The best examples that I could think of this are the Manley Ridge personal relationship. Manley, of course, was the first head of the Department of Homeland Security. Ridge was the first head of the Department of Homeland Security, and Manley was his counterpart in Canada. They had a great personal working relationship. They could get on the phone and talk to each other and cut through a lot of the bureaucracy at the federal level. But we also have something else that I think is very, very important, and that is at the state-provincial level. We have, particularly in Washington State, a very close relationship between the Washington governor and the British Columbia premier. These people meet annually. They have summits. They have taken upon certain kinds of initiatives on their own without permission from Washington and Ottawa to engage in certain kinds of bilateral activity. And they've been very successful. The Enhanced Driver's License is the best example. We also have very active stakeholder groups in the Pacific Northwest. I've mentioned a few of them here, the Pacific Northwest Economic Region being probably the best example. These are public-private organizations that have been in existence for many, many years, work very closely together. They bring together business people, academics, government people, local mayors, police, and so they've been very, very important
in terms of building those kinds of relationships that you need. Obviously, similar legal cultures has been a positive. And finally, I wouldn't underestimate the economic imperative that exists between Canada and the United States. A little different than Mexico and the United States in that 36 American states have Canada as their largest export partner. And so suddenly when people start thinking about plugging the border or slowing down the border, you get people's economic attention all through the United States. And 85%, as I said earlier, of Canadian exports go to the United States. Okay, moving along, there's also been numerous factors in frustration. Clearly, the thickening of the border continues, despite all of the good efforts that have been made. By thickening, what I'm talking about is congestion is as bad as it's ever been. Delays for trucks continue to be bad. There's been lots of times when people have not been allowed through the border, even though they've had proper documentation through bureaucratic fiascos and so on. Risk management, which is supposed to be the governing way we deal with the border, is being undermined, many people would argue, by what's called the trend in the United States towards zero risk. The Canadians in particular are very concerned about this, and they believe that the whole approach towards risk management, which is to say, let's look for the bad people and focus on them. And what they think is happening now is that everybody's presumed to be bad, and so it's zero risk as opposed to risk management. There's a whole proportionality metric that's which is a great source of concern. I simply say, is it worth it? The money we've spent, is there any evidence that this new fortified, militarized border on the Canadian-U.S. border has resulted in the capture of even one terrorist? And then, of course, there's the economic, the social, and the psychic costs, which Gordon, I think, laid out so beautifully in his presentation. This, by the way, is an area that gets lost often in all the discussion about economies and national security. We forget that these borders are places where there are incredibly intense social and cultural linkages, and of course that's true on the Mexican border as well as the Canadian border. And these kinds of traditional cultural ties are being stretched, in some cases broken. And finally, what is the end game? This is something we're very concerned about at Western Washington University, trying to come up with a vision of a 21st century border. Nobody that I've ever spoken with is happy with the status quo. We've got to change it. And I think Stephen Flynn, who has done a lot of writing on this, has made an important point when he said we can't simply think about the border or about security as defending a line on a map. We have to think about the complex commercial and social interactions that exist throughout the hemisphere. It's like a huge spider web. When we think about land, and we think about water, and we think about cyberspace, those are the connections and linkages that we need to be concerned about when we think about security. And finally, I think I'm maybe running a bit over time, a few implications for the U.S.-Mexican border, which we can talk about later. I'm concerned that there are many programs available to Canadians that are unavailable to Mexicans. For example, the Nexus iris scan for air pre-clearance is available to Canadians in terms of crossing into the United States. That program is not available to Mexicans. The Sentry program will be considered an unsuitable WHTI document after June 2009. The way things currently stand, a person who has a Sentry pass on the Mexican border will still have to have a passport to be able to use that Sentry card. That's not the case with the Canadian-U.S. border. Canadians will be able to use either their enhanced driver's license or their Nexus card and be WHT compliant. So it's a difference in the way Canadians and Mexicans are being treated in terms of coming into the United States. Groups of Canadian school children under the age of 16 will not have to have passports after June 2009 to enter the United States. If they have a birth certificate or some other foundational document that is acceptable. That is not true for Mexican kids coming into the United States. Again, it's unequal treatment, and I think it's a real problem. And finally, on the southern border, the enhanced driver's license will be, once you have an enhanced driver's license down here, and Arizona appears to be the closest, the enhanced driver's license will only be WHT compliant for U.S. citizens and not for Mexicans. Again, which is a real problem, I think, in terms of what is happening on the U.S.-Mexican border and this disparity in treatment. Finally, to conclude, the cooperative efforts on the northern border have been heavily based on trust and strong relationships at the working level, particularly the NGOs and the public-private agencies that I've mentioned. And I would argue that how can such efforts proceed when the political process is biased towards closing off rather than opening a border, which is a situation on the U.S.-Mexican border. The advantage, I think, that we see in the north is that the process continues to be a very open one, in which we're not essentially stopping traffic, building walls, although there has been talk about building a wall on the Canada-U.S. border. I don't think it'll ever happen, but there has been talk about doing that. We have a virtual wall in that there are sensors and cameras and so on, but there's no physical wall on the Canada-U.S. border, and there is at least a kind of psychology that the border remains open and that the process is to continue to open it as much as possible while we talk about how we deal with the reality of border security. And I think somehow that kind of conversation, that kind of philosophy has to be applied on the southern border as well. And with that, I'll stop, and thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Alper, for your presentation. We appreciate this very much. Albeit short, I think it was very substantive, and there's much we can talk about this as far as the comparisons between Canada and the United States versus Mexico and the United States and its border management policies. Very interesting. Resumiendo un poco de lo que mencionó el doctor Alper, inició con los antecedentes en la relación de cooperación fronteriza entre México y Estados Unidos, que se denominaba anteriormente la frontera más larga sin defensa. A ver, ¿cómo podríamos? The longest undefended border, la frontera más larga sin defensa, vaya. Indefensa. Indefensa. Muchas gracias, señor. Sin embargo, las cosas han cambiado en cuanto a las perspectivas de los Estados Unidos, en cuanto a que antes era un punto de orgullo esta frontera indefensa, pero que hoy ya es un punto de mayor ansiedad. Sirve esta frontera como una metáfora de lo que realmente fue lo que sucedió después del 11 de septiembre. La seguridad fronteriza antes del 11 de septiembre realmente se mantenía un perfil bastante bajo. Se dedicaba realmente la seguridad al combate de drogas, de la injerencia de drogas y de armas de fuego, sin realmente interrumpir el flujo de comercio. Hoy en día el 86% de las exportaciones canadienses realmente van a los Estados Unidos. Sin embargo, ha habido preocupaciones que han emergido, como son la Canadá multicultural y el tema del terrorismo. Y finalmente, ¿qué fue la gota, digamos, que derramó el vaso en cuanto a la prioridad que tomó la seguridad fronteriza en Canadá? Pues fue básicamente el Millennium Bomber en el año del 2000. Después del 11 de septiembre hubo gran preocupación, y la perspectiva estadounidense, de acuerdo a lo que nos menciona el doctor Alper, es que Canadá se convirtió realmente en un campo fértil para la entrada de algún potencial terrorista. Es decir, Estados Unidos veía a Canadá, la frontera canadiense de Estados Unidos, como un punto muy vulnerable en donde un terrorista podría entrar. Inclusive hubo pronunciamientos de varios políticos que propagaron este mito y que mencionaron que realmente los terroristas habían provenido realmente de Canadá. Sin embargo, el señor Alper dice que esto es falso. Un nuevo elemento dentro de esta defensa de la seguridad fronteriza es la militarización de los grandes lagos al norte de los Estados Unidos, frontera con Canadá. Sin embargo, pues los retos sigue siendo lo mismo, tratar de mantener una frontera abierta y al mismo tiempo tratar de inventar soluciones de cooperación para tratar de que los flujos de comercios se mantengan. Para ello se han establecido nuevos elementos para el manejo de la frontera, le llaman fronteras inteligentes, y estos son los nuevos programas como es el FAST, el Nexus, la Sentry, una de las cuales pues Sentry ya tenemos aquí en la frontera, y el FAST inclusive, el FAST para la cuestión de comercio y de camiones, exactamente. Mencionó muy brevemente la viabilidad de las PAN. Dice realmente que no le ve viabilidad, que lo ve muy débil en cuanto a esta cooperación de seguridad. Los elementos claves en la cooperación fronteriza después del 11 de septiembre fueron 5, que fue la convergencia institucional de Canadá y de Estados Unidos. Inclusive nos comenta que en Canadá se creó, se introdujo y se implementó, se aprobó la ley antiterrorismo, algo muy parecido a la ley patriota en Estados Unidos. Los programas, como los mencionamos, sobre aquellos viajeros de confianza que han sido ya previamente investigados y al no tener ningún tipo de antecedente penal, se les otorga una tarjeta, como en este caso la Sentry aquí en México, en Estados Unidos, y esto todo con la mira de hacer más fluido el cruce fronterizo. La cuestión del desaduanamiento, que ya existen 7 aduanas entre Estados Unidos y Canadá, en donde existen autoridades aduaneras, tanto canadienses como americanas, donde juntas, de manera conjunta, desaduanan, digamos, o liberan las mercancías para que puedan fluir. Y también existe una licencia de conducir que le llaman enhanced, pues nueva y mejorada, podríamos decir, que también ya funge ahorita inclusive como un mismo documento de identidad, que es validada por el propio gobierno de los Estados Unidos. Y pues también tenemos finalmente las iniciativas conjuntas en cuanto a la procuración de justicia o aplicación de justicia entre Canadá y Estados Unidos. Éxitos. Menciona que los acuerdos entre Canadá y Estados Unidos realmente no son nuevos, que han sido acuerdos que surgieron de acuerdos previos entre los dos países. Mencionó también las fuertes relaciones personales, las relaciones de confianza que existen entre Canadá y Estados Unidos a nivel regional y a nivel federal. Habló sobre la gran actividad que tienen los grupos de interés, especialmente los grupos de empresarios, que existe una cultura legal muy similar entre Canadá y Estados Unidos, y pues obviamente que existe un imperativo económico, el de no interrumpir los flujos comerciales, puesto la gran interdependencia que tienen ambos países de sus propios flujos comerciales. Y así como éxitos, pues ha habido también factores de frustración, que ha sido, también lo sufrimos aquí en el sur, al sur de la frontera de Estados Unidos, que es la congestión en cuanto al cruce fronterizo de mercancías y de personas. En cuanto también a la administración de riesgo, dice que también Estados Unidos, con la implementación de su riesgo cero, es decir, que no se va a aceptar ni un solo riesgo en la frontera, esto ha impedido que los esfuerzos que Canadá ha realizado se vean vulnerados por esta exigencia. No ha habido evidencia de que un solo terrorista haya sido capturado a raíz de esas nuevas medidas de seguridad. Y vamos, coincide el doctor Alper en lo mismo, ¿no? Que las fronteras realmente van más allá de estas medidas de seguridad, sino que los vínculos sociales, económicos y personales trascienden realmente las medidas de seguridad que se adopten. Muy bien, después de esa intervención vamos a abrir el espacio para comentarios de nuestros invitados, aquí mismo en Tijuana y también en Guadalajara y en la Ciudad de México. Monterrey, dijiste también.
No, Monterrey. Bueno, sí.
En Monterrey también. Sí, perdón. Sí, si te parece, empezamos con el cónsul Charles Smith, y si no hay alguna pregunta aquí, pues procederemos también con nuestros invitados allá en Guadalajara, en Monterrey, en Ciudad de México.
Un puntito nomás que, a point of fact, Dr. Alper, just we've been advised that the Century Pass will be accepted as a WHTI compliant document. I believe that information is on the State Department website and Department of Homeland Security. So I just wanted to make that quick comment. And
For Mexicans?
No, Mexicans, no. I mean, WHTI, though, is about proof of citizenship for U.S. citizens who are re-entering the United States.
But for Mexicans coming into the United States?
Mexicans, the requirements will remain the same for Mexicans. They'll require a visa as they always have, or a border crossing card.
That's what I meant,
Yeah.
actually. I may not have been clear.
So, just that point of fact. Thank you.
Ok, perdón, antes de proceder, también se me olvidó, si las personas que vayan a realizar alguna pregunta, si se pueden presentar con su nombre y la institución que representan, por favor. Gracias. Guadalajara, por favor.
¿Quieres hacer una pregunta?
No tenemos un comentario ahorita, entonces pasamos a la
Perfecto,
próxima.
todo muy claro. Pasamos a la Ciudad de México.
Hola, muchas gracias. No hay preguntas por el momento.
A ver, el doctor Tonatiuh Guillén, aquí en Tijuana, nos va a hacer un comentario.
Sí, por favor. Una pregunta que se deriva de las tres magníficas presentaciones que escuchamos y que me gustaría tener algún comentario. El hecho, por lo pronto, es de que hay dos trayectorias hacia las fronteras por parte de la política de Estados Unidos, una trayectoria hacia Canadá, otra trayectoria hacia México, si bien hay elementos en común dominados por el rubro de la seguridad. Y la pregunta se refiere al rol de los actores locales. Creo que ha sido interesante ver en el caso de Canadá y Estados Unidos el papel de los gobernadores en las fronteras, o el primer ministro en la provincia de Canadá y el gobernador en Estados Unidos, como actores que superan estas trayectorias o estas inercias, o que están en el proceso de superar también los actores económicos. Y lo menciono porque en el caso de la frontera México-Estados Unidos está ocurriendo un proceso no visible hasta hace poco tiempo, cada vez más visible y más fuerte, que es el papel de los gobernadores fronterizos, tanto del sur de Estados Unidos como del norte de México. Y es un papel político. Tienen capacidad, tienen fuerza. La pregunta es si son estos actores los que finalmente van a perfilar las condiciones de la frontera, lo que se mencionaba como la nueva frontera del siglo XXI. No se va a definir, creo yo, en el escenario México-Washington, sino con, esa es la pregunta, si se va a definir con los actores también que están pesando mucho cada vez más, creo yo, en la relación bilateral, que son estos gobernadores que incluso están ya asociados, tienen una conferencia de gobernadores fronterizos. Ese rol de los nuevos, de estos nuevos actores, ¿cuál pudiera ser en la definición del acomodo que se dé entre este balance entre permeabilidad de las fronteras para todo aquello que es pertinente al desarrollo, y del otro lado el rubro de seguridad? Esa tensión, ¿cuál pudiera ser ese rol de los actores locales, si van a lograr influir en la construcción de la frontera? Eso es una pregunta que creo deriva de los planteamientos que hemos escuchado hasta ahora. No sé si Manuel pueda.
En vista de que no hay traducción simultánea, si usted me permite, voy a contestar en inglés. I want to, the question has to do and is directed to three presenters. It has to do with the role of local governments and essentially below federal level participation, to what extent that influences the course of bilateral cooperation. And I think both Don Alper and Gordon Dillmore have a far more experience than I do in this area, and I would like them to elaborate. But I would like to make a general comment that as a way of introducing the response to that particular question, that obviously one of the most striking phenomena of the relationships between the United States, Mexico, and Canada over the last 50 years has been how far ahead of other international relationships these kinds of interactions began. That kind of sort of translocal, transnational relationship between state governments, Arizona and Sonora, and the governors associations and so forth, happened a lot sooner in this area than it did in many other parts of the world, in part because of the intensity of the economic and social interactions across these borders, and because the borders are relatively porous as well. But I think that I think I would make 2 points here, and perhaps they can either contradict them or qualify them in some way or clarify them. I would start by saying that a lot of the future initiative is in fact going to come from state and local governments in a variety of areas, because they see these issues much more clearly than is sometimes seen either in Washington and Mexico City. DF and DC are increasingly more alike, and I'm not sure that's good news, but that's the reality. So I think that would be my first major point, and they can elaborate on that. With the second one, which is a bit of a qualifier on the one point that I just made, is that there are indispensable roles for the federal governments of the three countries, regardless of the fact that governors and local government officials are going to play a bigger role. There are some things that only federal governments can do, and although the leadership will come to some extent from lower levels of government, it's really indispensable for federal governments to be engaged actively in this process, because there are going to be some things that only they can address.
Just wanted to mention that I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to talk about these other actors besides the national executive and some of the new actors. So, can you hear me? Okay. Nada más quería agregar que yo voy a hablar sobre este tema de otros actores en la política de seguridad nacional y seguridad fronteriza de México en la tercera sesión.
Muchas gracias.
If I could comment, we had a beautiful illustration this past fall when the wildfires were raging in California, utterly out of control, and it was quite moving actually how willing the Mexican firefighters were to cross the border and help California fight those fires, and they ran into problems with the border on occasion. But one of the TV stations here aired a very telling segment where they had an interview with the Mexican firefighters saying, well, we see our sister country in need over there, and we're firefighters. We want to cross the border and help someone in need. And the next shot was, you could see the flames on the other side of the border, and it was the fire truck crossing the border and the Customs and Immigration officer telling them, and I'm counting every one of you. And so the assistance came, but not necessarily with the help of the federal government.
Muy bien, creo que Monterrey, ¿alguna pregunta?
No tenemos pregunta. No tenemos pregunta por el momento. Seguimos adelante, gracias.
Ok, muy bien. Yes, Mr. Dillmore, you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to comment on Manuel's question. From my perception, I think in the United States we've almost gone full circle. When I say that, what I mean is that when the Bracero program terminated, I forget exactly what year it was,
64.
There was a substantial increase in the number of illegal entries, people that had previously, for the most part, been involved in the Bracero program. That terminated, and so they chose to come in illegally because they needed the employment. There was a concern that grew increasingly over the years and that resulted in 1968, Los Angeles, San Diego, Sacramento, Fresno, those city governments and county governments expressed concern over the impact of the undocumented workers that were coming into their areas. They put enough pressure on the federal government at that time in the Immigration Service that for over a year the Immigration Service, it was the Border Patrol and the Investigations Division, had extensive task forces that operated primarily in those metropolitan areas and in the adjoining rural areas to pick up the undocumented workers and return them to Mexico. So I think that is an example of what metropolitan governments can do, local governments can do to impact. That stopped. Trying to refresh my failing memory, I think probably about 1974, 75, and we went from that to the asylum cities phenomenon where various metropolitan areas around the country started expressing concern for the treatment and they voted locally to become asylum cities and provide areas of protection and whatnot. So we went to a situation where local government condoned it, encouraged it, and actually protected them in many instances.